Nobody photographed it. Nobody recorded it. Nobody was there to write it down for the history books. What happened in that hotel room on the morning of March 5th, 1968, existed only in the memory of two men, and both of them are gone now. But the people who knew them, the ones who were close enough to notice the shift in their eyes afterward, they all say the same thing. Something changed that morning, something that had no name and left no trace, something that only music can sometimes hold. This is the story of that morning, the one nobody talks about. The night before had been pure chaos. New York City, in early March 1968, was a city crackling with a particular kind of electricity, the kind that lives just beneath the surface of things, the kind you feel in your chest before you understand it in your mind. The Vietnam War was tearing the country open. Martin Luther King Jr. had less than a month left to live. The streets carried a weight that no one could quite name, and the music of that era absorbed all of it, every ounce of grief and rage and desperate, searching beauty. The Scene Club sat in the middle of Manhattan like a pressure valve. On any given night, it held the kind of energy that made you feel the walls might not contain it much longer. It was small, smoky, loud, a place where musicians came not to perform, but to collide, where ideas met at midnight and either caught fire or died quietly between drinks. On the night of March 4th, Jim Morrison was already there when Jimi Hendrix took the stage. Morrison had arrived the way he always arrived, slightly apart from everything, his dark eyes moving through the room like he was cataloging something invisible. He was 24 years old. The Doors had already changed American music. He was famous in the way that felt less like achievement and more like whether something that had simply happened to him, something he hadn't fully decided what to do with yet. He stood near the back and watched Jimi Hendrix play. What happened next has been told many times in many ways. Morrison, deep in whatever internal landscape he was navigating that evening, climbed onto the stage uninvited. The details depend on who you ask. Some accounts vivid, others vague, all of them carrying the particular blur of a night that existed at the edge of what was manageable. Hendrix kept playing. The music absorbed the intrusion the way water absorbs a stone, a disturbance, a ripple, then stillness again. By the time the night ended, both men had moved on. The crowd dispersed. The city kept moving. But something had been left unfinished. The morning after arrives differently when you haven't slept. Jim Morrison was in his hotel room when the knock came. Not a loud knock, not the frantic knock of a manager or a journalist. A quiet knock, the kind that carries intention, without urgency. He opened the door. Jimi Hendrix was standing in the hallway alone, no manager beside him, no bandmate waiting nearby. Just Jimi Hendrix, 25 years old, in the particular stillness of a man who has decided to do something difficult and has arrived before doubt could stop him. Morrison stepped back and let him in. There are moments in the history of music, private, unwitnessed moments, that contain more truth than any performance, more meaning than any record that ever charted. This was one of those moments. Two young men in a hotel room in New York City, the morning after a night that could have hardened into resentment, choosing instead to sit down across from each other and tell the truth. Hendrix was not a man who needed to diminish others to feel his own size. He was large enough in himself that he could afford to be genuinely interested, and Jim Morrison was genuinely interesting. They talked first, before the music, before anything else. They simply talked. This is the part that gets lost in the mythology, the part where both men were just human. Not the lizard king, not the electric gypsy, not the icons that posters and album covers had already begun constructing. Just two young men from different corners of America who had each, through entirely different means, arrived at the same impossible intersection, the place where personal pain becomes public art. Hendrix had grown up in Seattle, raised in a poverty that most people never fully understood from the outside. He had taught himself guitar with ferocious dedication, playing in clubs and on street corners before anyone knew his name. He had gone to England to become famous because America wasn't ready for him, yet a fact that carried its own particular weight, one that never fully left him. Morrison had grown up moving an admiral's son, who learned early that attachment was temporary, that the places and people you loved could disappear with the next set of orders. He had turned that rootlessness into philosophy, into poetry, into a stage presence so charged with barely contained intensity that audiences never quite knew if they were witnessing a performance or something closer to a confession. Both men understood what it meant to give something real in front of strangers. Both men understood the cost. That morning, in that room, neither of them was performing. Morrison spoke about the night before. Not defensively, those who knew him said defensiveness was rarely his register. He spoke about it the way he spoke about most things that mattered, obliquely, circling the center, approaching the truth from an angle because the truth head-on was sometimes too much to hold directly. He spoke about what it felt like to be in a crowd and feel the edges of yourself dissolving, about the precise, terrifying line between artistic surrender and simple destruction, about how he wasn't always sure which side of that line he was standing on. Hendrix listened. This was one of his great gifts, the ability to be genuinely present with what another person was saying, to hear not just the words but the weight behind them. He didn't rush to respond. He sat with what Morrison had said long enough to understand it. Then he picked up his guitar. What came next was not a performance. It was something quieter and stranger, and more intimate than performance. Hendrix began to play softly the way you play, when you're thinking rather than demonstrating. The notes were exploratory, unresolved, circling around a feeling rather than stating it. Morrison listened in silence. Then, gradually, he began to speak, not singing, not reciting, but speaking in that low, particular voice that somehow carried across any distance. The words were not planned. They rose from whatever the conversation had stirred. Images of water and fire and disappearance. Lines about fathers, about the desert, about the specific loneliness of being watched by people who think they see you. Hendrix's guitar moved around the words like weather around a mountain present, responsive, not competing. People in adjacent rooms that morning later described hearing something through the walls they couldn't quite categorize. Not music, exactly. Not conversation. Something in between, something that had no genre and no name. Something that existed only because two people had decided, in the privacy of that morning, to be honest. It lasted hours, long enough for the light outside to shift. By the time it ended, neither man spoke for a long moment. Then Hendrix set the guitar down. The silence between them had changed quality. It had gone from the tense silence of two people who don't know each other yet to the quieter silence of two people who do. They were not close friends afterward. The world was too chaotic for that, their schedules, their entourages, the constant forward motion that fame demands. The machinery of the music industry in 1968 was not designed to protect moments of genuine human connection. It was designed to produce, to book, to keep moving. But people who knew both men said something shifted after that morning. A new quality of attention in the way Morrison talked about music. a slightly less defended relationship with the vulnerability he had always channeled, but not always acknowledged. And something in Hendrix, as well, a recognition of the particular courage it took to put language at the center of a performance, to trust words the way Morrison trusted them. There is a particular loneliness to being the kind of artist that both Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison were. Not the loneliness of isolation. Both men were surrounded, constantly, by people who wanted things from them. The loneliness of singularity, of being the only person in any given room who sees things at the angle you see them, of producing something from the deepest part of yourself and watching it be received as entertainment. That morning in the hotel room was, for a few hours, the opposite of that loneliness. Two people who saw things at the same impossible angle, recognizing each other across the distance of entirely different lives. Jim Morrison died in Paris on July 3, 1971. He was 27 years old. Jimi Hendrix had died 9 months earlier, on September 18, 1970. He was also 27. The closeness of those dates is one of the things that history keeps returning to. Two men of almost identical age, at almost identical moments in their trajectories, gone within less than a year of each other. What was lost was irreplaceable. Not the records remain, permanent, and still capable of stopping a room. What was lost was everything those records were pointing toward. The next album, the next evolution. The territory that only becomes visible after you've fully inhabited the previous one. What was lost, also, was the private history, the moments that never became mythology, because they never became public. The conversations in hotel rooms, the hours of music that existed only in real time and then dissolved. The things said between two people that shifted something in both of them without ever being recorded or turned into content. That morning in New York City was one of those moments. Both men were, in their different ways, trying to answer the same question. What is music actually for? Not commercially, not formally, but in the deepest sense what human need it serves that nothing else can serve in quite the same way. Morrison's answer was linguistic and poetic and shamanic music, as ritual, as confession, as the place where the personal becomes universal. Hendrix's answer was almost wordless music, as pure emotional transmission, the guitar as a direct line from interior life to exterior world, bypassing language entirely. That morning, those two answers were in the same room together. Neither man converted the other, but something passed between them, some mutual recognition of what the other was doing and why it mattered, some understanding that there was more than one way to tell the truth. The hotel room is gone now. The scene club is gone. The specific texture of New York City in March 1968, the smell of it, the sound of it, the particular weight of that historical moment exists only in memory and archive. But the music remains. Both bodies of work, taken together, constitute one of the most emotionally complete portraits of what it meant to be alive and young and fully awake in that era, to feel everything too much, to turn that excess of feeling into something that could be shared, to stand in front of strangers and offer the most interior parts of yourself, night after night, until the body couldn't continue. What Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix shared in that hotel room was the knowledge of what that cost, the weight of giving everything, repeatedly, to people who received it as entertainment rather than sacrifice, the loneliness of that transaction, the beauty of it, the impossibility of stopping. Neither of them stopped. Both of them gave until there was nothing left to give. And the songs they left behind carry the fingerprints of that generosity. That particular, costly willingness to be fully honest in front of the world. The morning after the night everyone remembers is the story nobody tells. Now you know what happened there.